So the CIA may be breeding Nazi terror in Ukraine. I thought this was a really solid piece because there's very little talk of what this discussion is. I think there's more social media hype about Azov Battalion now than there was previously, because a few people have seen some of these photos, floating around, and they're like, holy crap, these guys have swastikas, they have SS tattoos, et cetera. And there's videos. In fact, if you go back even into some of the old Vice videos, you will, if they're not talking about it in the Vice video, but you can flash by and see guys with various types of Nazi tattoos, ones that say white pride, all of these sorts of things, even though that's not what Vice was talking about. I noticed that you could see this stuff. So basically, this argument is the U.S. government has a well-documented history of backing extremist groups as part of a panoply of foreign policy misadventures. I mean, we have decades of this evidence. This is not a controversial statement, right? So the CIA worked with Cuban anti-Fidel Castro radicals who turned Miami into a hub of terrorist violence. In the 1980s, the agency supported and encouraged Islamic radicals converging in Afghanistan. This is true. I mean, we armed Al-Qaeda to a certain extent, and then we wondered why those arms eventually got turned against us, right? So based on a new report, it looks like we may soon be able to add another to that list of fatally unlearned lessons, Ukrainian neo-Nazis. According to recent Yahoo News reports, since 2015, the CIA has been secretly training forces in Ukraine to serve as insurgent leaders, in the words of one former intelligence official, in case Russia ends up invading the country. Current officials are claiming the training is purely for intelligence collection, but the former officials Yahoo spoke to said the program involved training in firearms, cover and move, and camouflage, among other things. I wanted to bring up in 2016, because I think this relates to what they're discussing in this article. In 2016, Obama signed the Consolidated Appropriations Act. Before he signed it, there was an amendment that was going to be added, and it was removed. And that amendment basically forbid the government from funding the Azov Battalion in Ukraine. So the money that would go there had to be excluded from funding them. But because of pressure from the Pentagon, that amendment was removed. So we ended up basically giving these guys money. What do you make of this? Because I think it's an important part of this discussion. Because obviously, when we talk about what this government is and what these militias are, they definitely are on the fascist side, and there's really unsavory elements that are involved. And I think some of that is sort of whitewashed under this premise that the current president is Jewish, right? There's like everybody's trying to pick their battles instead of looking at the complex situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people tend to get into sort of these rhetorical traps where it's like even anti-imperialists, when discussing Syria, it sort of all became about the CIA propping up Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra. When in reality, I mean, the CIA was pouring money into Marxist rebel groups. I mean, like the YPG. So at a certain point, you have to be like, well, is this about the ideology of the rebels, or are you just against the CIA propping up these proxy forces? Because I personally am just against the CIA propping up any proxy force to meddle in another country.
So am I. I agree with you. I think it's a problem.
If they're Islamic radical or not. So I always found that sort of strange that became the focus of Syria. And I do see a tendency in anti-imperialism to just paint everybody in Ukraine as a neo-Nazi. I mean, when the reality is there is a serious neo-Nazi element within these militias. And I do think it's very notable and telling that it's like the U.S., the Pentagon couldn't just let go of the fact that the Azov Battalion was going to be excluded from the supplemental that was being given to Ukraine. Well, it's like, well, why? Like, why couldn't they just be like, okay, fine, the Azov Battalion won't get the money, but everybody else will? I think that really says a lot in the sense that the Azov Battalion isn't just a tiny militia that happens to be neo-Nazi. They do have an incredible amount of power in Ukraine.
Yeah, they're a political party now too.
Yeah, and I think that's also being put on display now. It's like 4 or 5 years later, 6 years later, after a lot of people already were like, wait a second, all those people are Nazis. We still have articles coming out today of like them still trying to whitewash, like Western media, I mean, trying to whitewash Azov members or Azov photo ops. And it's like, geez, you would think you guys would have learned by now not to do this. It's just so obvious. So
It's
that
so
to me
obvious.
is like, it does indicate that there is some reason why that group is really important to whatever this United States effort is. And it's just odd. It's strange because it's like, well, geez, you would think the optics of that would be so bad, you guys would figure out something else, but they haven't. So
they haven't. It's kind of crazy. So let's shift gear and talk about NATO for a second, because I do think NATO is definitely part and parcel to the conversation. In fact, speaking of Azov Battalion, they were part and parcel to NATO too. There's a photo that started circulating on social media was quite a few years old. I remember seeing it back, 3 or 4 years ago, in which you had some Azov Battalion guys with NATO forces, and in the background you have the NATO flag, you have the Azov Battalion flag, which is the Wolf's Angel, and then you had an actual swastika flag, right? So this had kind of started blowing up on social media, and it's a genuine photo. Now, whether or not NATO knows that that's to be true, I think that they do. My thing is this: it's disturbing, yes, but it's not solely only happening in Ukraine. We could talk about White Rex and some of the other neo-Nazis that are Russian, that are also very much right-wing and fascist, that are, the main guy, and I can't think of his name right now, that's against Putin, that is jailed. He has definitely fascist tendencies in his past and has made some incredibly racist statements. So this one aspect is only, like, I feel like both sides are trying to weaponize their version of that, when really it's a more global problem that we're facing, right? Now, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, there is a tendency, I think, because the U.S., has initiated this new Cold War essentially against Russia because of RT America. Even my sister worked there. There is a tendency to over defend Russia's behavior, and I only mean that like I mostly take the side against the United States, but when it comes to like let's just say the war on terror era. There's a lot of, I think Russia's leadership gets a lot of free passes when it comes to basically waging their own war on terror, basically generating sort of an Islamophobic landscape rhetorically in Russia, demonizing Muslims, what they did in Chechnya. There are a lot of things that have parallels to like our neocons here. And And when it comes down to it, it's like they're not heroes. So it's like, it's just, I do think people tend to get in a little bit of these like team, tribal, sort of sports team kind of stuff. But yeah, like when it comes to like Russia's neo-Nazi stuff, I personally am not really that familiar with like how that blends into their military. I think what's notable about Azov is that like it's getting like U.S. funding, for.
Oh, I agree. That is the salient part of the discussion. Not only is it getting U.S. funding, they have been trained by the CIA. They absolutely have. I don't think that's a controversial statement. And they have now been incorporated into the National Guard in Ukraine, which is their official fighting force. So they're no longer this separate voluntary militia. They can't write that off as like, they're not really Ukrainian. They're just voluntary militia. No, they definitely are. And they are definitely been backed by U.S. funding. That's not controversial. So it is a problem.
Thanks for watching. And make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.